Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice, and the sound of rain, carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. The sky above the Nile River begins to shift from deep indigo to soft gold. Morning breaks gently over the fields and temples of ancient Egypt. The breeze carries the scent of water and grain. And somewhere in the small village just outside Memphis, a farmer's household begins to stir. This is not a story about pharaohs or gods. Not yet. This is the story of food, of bread, onions, beer, and family. This is the story of how ordinary people ate, drank, and shared life in the land of pyramids. Meet Nebet. She's a mother of 3, a wife of a field worker, and most importantly, today a cook. She wakes before the sun fully rises her home, still wrapped in the last whispers of night. The house is simple, made of mud brick with a thatched roof and a small courtyard where a stone oven waits. Chickens rustle in their coop. Clay pots line the walls filled with grains, dates, honey, and spices. Nebet begins her day by checking the dough she set to rise the night before. It's been sitting in a ceramic jar covered with linen naturally fermenting from wild yeast in the air. She tears off a piece and begins forming small flat loaves, pressing them with her fingers, then sliding them into the tanure, a cone-shaped clay oven set into the earth. The smell of baking bread fills the home. Outside, her husband Hori prepares to head into the fields. Before he leaves, Nebet hands him a simple meal wrapped in linen barley bread, dried fish, and a handful of figs. It's not extravagant, but it will keep him working through the heat of the day. He kisses her cheek and disappears down the road, joining other farmers in the early light. Meanwhile, Nebet's eldest daughter Sia starts grinding more emmer wheat using a large basalt mortar. It's back-breaking work and slow but necessary. The fine flour will be used for sweet cakes later in the day, and coarser meal will go into more bread. Nearby, Nebet prepares the day's beer. Yes, beer. In ancient Egypt, beer was a daily staple. It wasn't the bubbly hoppy brew we know today. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and mildly alcoholic, made from partly baked loaves of bread soaked in water and left to ferment sometimes with added dates or herbs for sweetness. It was safer to drink than water and full of nutrients. By mid-morning, the courtyard is alive with activity. Nebet feeds the younger children small pieces of soft bread dipped in honey and milk. Then she turns to preparing the main midday meal, a stew of lentils leeks and garlic seasoned with coriander and salt, cooked slowly over coals. She slices onions with a flint knife, adds them to the bubbling pot, then begins preparing a side of grilled goose rare, but available today thanks to a barter with a neighbor. The goose is rubbed with herbs, seared over fire, then set aside to cool. Outside, neighbors pass by and chat. One brings Nebet a bundle of fresh green chickpeas. Another drops off dried sycamore figs in exchange for honey. Food is not bought in coins here. It's exchanged, gifted, or grown. Meanwhile, across town, in the large home of a scribe named Jedhor, an entirely different kind of breakfast is taking place. Jedhor is literate, wealthy, educated, and in the service of the temple. His table is covered with linen, his servants busy preparing a spread of fruits, cheese, fresh bread, and even wine, a rare luxury for the morning. As the sun rises, so too does the divide between what different people eat. Yet whether rich or poor, noble or farmer food connects them all. Bread and beer always present. Onions and garlic beloved by all. Dates and honey symbols of sweetness in both life and the afterlife. Back in Nebet's home, the stew is ready. She ladles it into shallow clay bowls and calls her children. They sit cross-legged on reed mats in the shade, eating with their hands, dipping bread into the steaming mixture. It's simple, yes, but full of flavor and warmth. There's no sense of rushing. Meals are not fast. They are grounding. They are the pause between labor and rest. In the background, the Nile flows, steady, eternal. And across Egypt, thousands of other homes eat meals much like this one, sharing the same ingredients shaped by the same river. Food is survival. But in ancient Egypt, food is also celebration, offering ritual and love. And this is only the morning. As the sun climbs higher in the Egyptian sky, the golden heat begins to thicken over the fields and temples. By now, Nebet has finished preparing the midday meal, and her children have returned indoors to escape the brightness. The scent of lentils and roasted goose still lingers in the shaded courtyard. But not all meals in Egypt are for humans. A short walk from Nebet's modest home, the Temple of Hathor stands tall. It is not as massive as the temples of Karnak or Luxor, but it commands reverence. Here, food isn't just sustenance, it's a bridge between mortals and divinity. In ancient Egypt, every temple had kitchens, bakeries, and storerooms dedicated solely to preparing offerings. These weren't metaphorical. The gods were thought to consume the essence of food, while the physical items were later redistributed to temple workers, priests, and the poor. Inside the temple's rear courtyards, a group of kitchen attendants begins their midday work. Bread is baked in a similar style to that in Nebet's home, but here it is often molded into special shapes, tiny pyramids, fish, or lotus flowers. Loaves may be adorned with dates or sesame if available. These aren't just meals, they're symbols of abundance. The chief cook, an older man named Paten, carefully arranges the day's offerings on wide, shallow trays. Figs, cucumbers, leeks, onions, lotus roots, and honey cakes shaped like the eye of Horus. A side of grilled fish and a roast quail complete the display. A jug of beer and a small amphora of wine are added to the set. Before these trays are brought before the altar, a priest steps forward. He chants prayers in the old tongue, waving incense and sprinkling holy water. This is called hetep dinesu, a traditional offering formula. He speaks not just to Hathor, but to every divine being watching over the land. An offering which the king gives: bread, beer, cattle, fowl, alabaster, and linen, that the Ka may be satisfied. The trays are laid before the statue of Hathor, hidden behind a curtain. For a few sacred minutes, it is believed the goddess draws in the essence of the food, its spirit, its life. Afterward, the offerings are removed. Some will go to the high priest. Others will be divided among the temple staff. Nothing is wasted. Food is not just divine, it's precious. Back in the village, Nebet helps prepare another kind of sacred meal, not for gods, but for the spirits of the dead. Tomorrow is a remembrance day for her mother, who passed 5 years ago. Egyptian beliefs held that the dead lived on in the afterlife, but only if their memory and their Ka was nourished through offerings. She begins crafting funerary food, small loaves sweetened with honey, and dates a dish of lentils mixed with herbs and a dried fish wrapped in linen. These are placed on a tray, along with a small cup of beer and 2 onions. Her eldest daughter helps decorate a tiny clay amulet with blue paint, a symbol of protection. The next morning, Nebet and her children will carry this tray to her mother's burial niche, where they will light incense, speak her name, and place the food before her resting place. They'll sit together and eat their own versions of the same meal, linking the worlds of the living and the dead with shared nourishment. In ancient Egypt, food was memory. It was how you proved that someone mattered. Meanwhile, far from the villages on the estate of a wealthy noble outside Thebes, an entirely different kind of afternoon meal is taking place. Under a painted portico, servants move silently between long, low tables. The nobleman reclines on a cushioned bench surrounded by guests. Slaves fan the air while musicians play lutes and hand drums. On the table before them are rare delicacies, duck stuffed with garlic and nut scrapes imported from northern lands, and chilled wine poured from alabaster jars. These feasts were not daily events, but when they happened, they were theatrical. Platters of beef roasted with onions and spiced with cumin were carved with silver knives. Baskets of fresh bread drizzled with honey or filled with dried fruits were passed around. There were boiled eggs, grilled eel-fried lotus root, even soft cheeses made from goat's milk. For the elite, food wasn't just nourishment, it was status. And yet, at its core, the ingredients were the same wheat fish onions, herbs beer. What changed was how they were arranged, who served them, and what they meant. Food revealed your place in the world, but it also bound the world together. Back in the village, Nebet rinses lentils for dinner. Her hands move with practiced rhythm. She hums softly, an old hymn her mother once sang while cooking. The courtyard is calm now. The heat has passed. The shadows are longer. And just like that, the day moves toward evening. The sun begins to dip behind the western horizon, where ancient Egyptians believed the souls of the dead journeyed each night. As the shadows stretch long across the Nile's banks, a calm descends on the village. The heat of the day lifts, and the breeze from the water turns cool and sweet. This is when most families in ancient Egypt gathered for their final meal. Inside Nebet's home, the courtyard is dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. She kneels beside a clay pot set over coals, stirring a thick stew made from lentils, garlic, and wild greens. A splash of sour beer adds depth, while crushed coriander and cumin fill the air with spice. This dish is hearty and familiar, something passed down from her grandmother's kitchen, made to fill bellies after long hours in the field. Across the courtyard, her son returns from helping at the irrigation channels. He's dusty and tired, but his eyes light up when he sees the bread rising beside the fire. Tonight's loaves are shaped into small half-moons, crispy on the outside, soft in the center. Nebet brushes each one with sesame oil before placing them on hot stones to finish. Meanwhile, Eri Nebet's husband returns from the fields, carrying a bundle wrapped in linen, 2 small tilapia caught in a shallow canal. It's a lucky catch. The fish will be rubbed with herbs and grilled over flame, then served with pickled onions and cucumber slices. Fish was a staple of the Egyptian diet, especially for those who lived close to the Nile. Tilapia catfish and mullet were common, caught fresh or salted and dried for later. Richer households might enjoy eels or even Nile perch, marinated and cooked with pomegranate syrup or garlic paste. Vegetables were always present. The Nile's annual flood left behind rich black silt, perfect for growing onions, garlic lettuce leeks, chickpeas, lentils, melons, cucumbers, and radishes. Crops were grown year-round, rotating with the river's rhythm. Each season brought its own flavors. In winter, there were plenty of green vegetables and legumes. In summer, dates and figs filled every bowl. Autumn brought the best honey and wine. Meat was rarer. Cattle, goats, ducks, and geese were eaten, but mostly during festivals or offerings. The average Egyptian didn't eat meat daily. When they did, it was often stewed with onions and herbs to make it stretch. More often, meals relied on fish, legumes, and flatbreads to provide nourishment. Tonight, Nebet adds a special treat, a sweet dessert made from mashed dates, nuts, and honey, formed into small balls and rolled in sesame seeds. It's not something they have every night, but today is a day of quiet thanks. For health, for family, for surviving the fever that struck the village weeks ago. Her children clap when they see the treats. Even her husband grins, wiping sweat from his brow as he kneels beside the low table. There is no silverware here, only fingers and flatbread used as scoops and spoons. The family gathers on reed mats, seated cross-legged plates, arranged in a simple circle. Breadfish, lentil stew, pickled vegetables, and date balls. A clay pitcher of beer is passed around, everyone drinking from the same rim. And though the meal is modest, it is rich in something far older than gold ritual. They begin, as always, by offering the first bite to the gods. A small piece of bread is placed in a bowl near the hearth, dedicated silently to Isis, the goddess of life and home. Then they eat. Conversation flows slowly. The children talk about what they saw at the river. Erie tells a story about a snake in the canal that chased one of the oxen. Nebet chuckles, shaking her head. Laughter fills the courtyard, and for a moment the hardships of Egyptian life fall away. These are the moments that never make it onto temple walls, no pharaohs, no hieroglyphs. But this is where the soul of Egypt lived. As the meal ends, Nebet stores the leftover stew in a cool clay jar, covers it with linen, and sets it aside for tomorrow. The remaining bread will be hung in a basket above the fire to stay dry. Her daughter helps clean the clay plates with sand and water, then hangs them on a wooden rack. The youngest child, full and sleepy, curls beside the fire with a carved wooden cow in his hands. Nebet and Erie remain awake a little longer. They sit in silence, staring at the stars beginning to appear above the palms. In the distance, a priest's chant floats on the wind, a hymn to the sun, god Ra, who has passed safely through the underworld once again and will rise in the morning. Nebet presses her fingers into the folds of her dress. There's still flour beneath her nails, still the scent of fish and garlic on her hands. But she smiles. This life built of rhythm and food and fire is hard, but it is also holy. Because in Egypt, every act of preparing food is an act of faith. Every loaf of bread is a continuation of a story that began thousands of years ago. And every shared meal is a reminder we live, we work, we eat, and we remember. Even in the land of the Nile, where floods brought rich soil and steady harvests, ancient Egyptians knew the importance of preparation. After dinner, while the fire in Nebet's courtyard burns low, she moves quietly through her storage room. This narrow, cool chamber, carved partly into the earth, holds the family's pantry. On woven shelves and in thick ceramic jars sit the reserves that ensure survival when the river runs too high or too low, or when trade routes fall silent. She lifts the lid of a sealed jar. Inside are pickled radishes, pungent and sharp. Another holds sun-dried dates, their sugars darkened and concentrated. Hanging from the rafters are strings of dried fish cured with salt and smoke weeks ago during a glut of river catch. On one side, jars of beer ferment under linen covers, while large crocks of honey rest next to bricks of dried figs. Food in Egypt was abundant, but only when carefully managed. And this work, this silent, endless maintenance of sustenance, fell largely on women like Nebet. In homes across the land, from Thebes to the Delta, women were the guardians of the kitchen. They baked, brewed, preserved, and bartered. In elite households, they directed teams of servants and scribes. In poorer homes, they did it all with their own two hands. Nebet's kitchen may be humble, but her knowledge is vast. She knows exactly how long onions will keep before sprouting. She can feel with her fingers when flour is too coarse. She can brew beer strong enough for barter or mild enough for a child. And in this, she is powerful, not in the way of generals or pharaohs, but in the way that feeds nations. As she seals a jar of salted goose fat and wipes her hands clean, her daughter Sia watches closely. One day, it will be her turn. But not all meals are meant for ordinary days. Sometimes food becomes part of ritual celebration or remembrance, and the recipes change. Feasts of love. Food at weddings. Weddings in ancient Egypt weren't grand state ceremonies, they were family events sealed by contract music and food. When Nebet's cousin married last year, the courtyard was filled with the aroma of grilled lamb marinated in beer and herbs. Neighbors brought baskets of melons, cucumbers, and lotus roots. A communal pot simmered with lentils and leeks, and a tray of honey pastries, golden and flaky, sat near the altar. The centerpiece was a large cake of sweet bread shaped like a scarab beetle, symbolizing rebirth and good fortune. It was soaked in honey and scattered with chopped nuts. The newlyweds shared the first bite. These moments weren't just festive, they were sacred. Sharing food was an oath, a promise between families sealed not with gold, but with grain. Feeding the dead, food at funerals. Not all ceremonies are joyful. When Nebet's father passed away, the family mourned for weeks, but they also cooked. They prepared milk-soaked bread, symbolizing purity. Onions placed beneath the tongue of the deceased to allow him to speak in the afterlife. And boiled duck laid beside his body before burial. Funerals included not just tears, but feasting for both the living and the dead. And the offerings didn't end at burial. Every year after, on the day of remembrance, food would be brought again, beer bread, and dates placed by the tomb, eaten as the name of the departed was spoken aloud. Egyptians believed the ka, or soul, needed nourishment even in death. To forget to feed your ancestors was to condemn them to hunger in eternity. Joy in the field's food. During festivals. And then there were the great festivals when the temples opened their doors and food flowed like the Nile. During the festival of Opet, entire towns celebrated the union of Amun and Mut. Boats floated down the river, music echoed through stone courtyards, and priests distributed offerings. Even commoners received their share goat meat beer and fresh fruit laid out by temple kitchens. During the Wepet Renpet, the Egyptian New Year families would gather under the stars to eat pomegranate stew, roasted goose, and garlic bread, shaped like ankhs, the symbol of life. Sweet wine was poured, and old songs were sung. Nebet remembers such nights dancing with her mother near the riverbank, the glow of lanterns flickering in her memory like the first stars of evening. Back in the present, she places a few dried onions near the fire and turns to her daughter. Tomorrow, she says, we start the pickling again. Sia sighs but smiles. She knows the rhythm. It is part of her now, as it was for the women before her. Egyptian life was built on preparation not just of bricks or temples, but of food, of flavor, of ritual. A forgotten jar of grain could mean starvation, but a well-packed shelf. It was survival. It was pride. And in every stored olive, every salted fish, every loaf baked with care, there lived not just a meal, but a story. As the Nile carved its life-giving path through Egypt, it didn't just shape the land, it shaped society. And in no place was that more visible than at the table. While families like Nebet's gathered each night to share lentil stew and flatbread by oil lamp, just a short journey away behind thick stone walls and painted columns, a different kind of meal was unfolding. In the palace of an elite official in Thebes, the dining room is quiet but carefully curated. Soft light filters through lattice windows. Incense burns slowly in the corners. The man of the house, a vizier named Qais, sits reclining on a cushioned chair while servants place dishes before him in a particular order, not just for taste, but for ritual status and symbolism. There are whole roasted quail dusted with coriander and wrapped in grape leaves. Honey-glazed figs sit beside golden rounds of cheese made from cow's milk. Jars of sweet palm wine chilled in stone basins, are opened only after a priest offers a blessing. The bread is fine and white-sieved, sifted and kneaded by trained hands. This is not the bread Nebet makes at home. This is palace bread made from pure wheat instead of coarse emmer, and baked in molds shaped like sacred animals or symbols, ankhs, lotus flowers, scarabs. Every bite is a statement. To be wealthy in Egypt wasn't just about what you could afford, it was about what you could eat every day without thinking. And for the elite, meat was no longer an occasional treat. It was a regular presence, duck, goose, lamb, even beef from temple herds, food as political currency. But not all abundance came from wealth alone. Much of it came from access, specifically access to the granaries of the state. Ancient Egypt's government wasn't just a spiritual theocracy, it was one of history's most complex bureaucracies, and its control over food distribution was central to its power. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was the lord of bread. Grain collected as taxes from farmers like Irie was stored in massive state granaries. From there, it was distributed back to the people as payment for labor, as rations for temple staff, or as rewards for loyalty. A man who built a pyramid might not be paid in silver, but he would be paid in barley. A priest who sang morning hymns might be fed in goose and wine. A scribe copying spells onto papyrus might receive salted fish and cakes for his work. Even famine could be political. During years of poor flooding, when the Nile ran low and crops failed, those with state connections ate well, while others scraped the bottom of their storage jars. Menus of the ruling class. Records from tombs and scrolls reveal the full extent of elite meals. One banquet, hosted by Queen Taye during her husband Amenhotep III's reign, featured spiced lamb with pomegranate glaze, lotus root salad with onions and mint, stuffed dates with almond paste, fresh mangoes and imported olives from the Levant, bread scented with cinnamon and sweet herbs, chilled wine served in gold-handled cups. These weren't just meals, they were theater. Power presented on plates, diplomacy made edible. And yet, for all the wealth, the foundation remained the same: bread and beer, the twin pillars of the Egyptian diet. The difference lay in refinement, variety, and ritual. Contrast in the village. Back in Nebet's village, her son is eating crushed garlic with salt, mashed into a paste, and spread over coarse bread. It's sharp, filling, and delicious. For him, this meal is normal. He doesn't dream of quail or pomegranates. He dreams of full bellies and good harvests. He dreams of becoming a scribe one day, not for gold or land, but because scribes eat better. Sia, his sister, watches as her mother boils onions for pickling, and she wonders what it would be like to taste cheese that wasn't sour, or bread that didn't scratch the back of her throat. But these thoughts pass quickly. Food for them is life, not luxury. And yet, despite these differences, there is no shame in Nebet's cooking. In Egyptian culture, food was sacred at all levels. The same gods who received roasted bulls in temples also received bowls of lentils and crushed herbs from commoners. The same spices that coated royal lamb were found, if rarely, in village stews, and at every table from peasant hut to palace garden, the act of eating remained a moment of connection to the land, to the Nile, to the ancestors, the dignity of the common meal. One evening, a traveling merchant passes through the village and offers Nebet a strange fruit in exchange for a jar of her pickled turnips. She accepts. It's called a citron-sour fragrant rare. She slices it thin and mixes it with dates and honey to make a new dish, something her children have never tasted before. For a brief moment, her courtyard holds something rare, the taste of a world beyond their borders. And just like that, a meal becomes memory. In ancient Egypt, food was never just food. It was never just something chewed and swallowed, never simply grain boiled or meat roasted. It was magic. It was language. It was offering protection, punishment, transformation. It was sacred. From the smallest village to the grandest temple, Egyptians believed that what they ate and what they offered was deeply connected to the invisible world, to the realm of gods, spirits, and the eternal cycle of life and death. And so every meal carried weight far beyond its calories. In Nebet's modest home, each loaf of bread she bakes is marked not only with flour-dusted fingerprints, but also with meaning. When she shapes a batch into crescent moons and small birds for a festival, she isn't being whimsical. She's invoking fertility, good harvest, and divine protection. Symbols mattered. Bread, shaped like fish, brought luck in fishing loaves, marked with eyes protected against the evil eye. In wealthier homes, food was carved into sacred shapes, dates formed into cobras. Honey poured over cakes, molded like the eye of Horus. These weren't just decorations, they were prayers you could taste. Even the simplest dishes held layers of belief. Onions were sacred to many gods, particularly to Osiris, lord of the underworld. Egyptians believed onions had layers like the soul, and their scent could ward off evil. Garlic, too, wasn't merely food. It was medicine amulet and spiritual armor. Soldiers ate garlic before battle, not just for strength, but for protection. Laborers who built the pyramids were often paid in beer and onions. Why? Because those things didn't just feed the body. They fed the Ka, the spiritual double of a person which lived on after death. In temples, the connection between food and the divine was even more explicit. Every morning, priests would awaken the god statues with incense and words, then serve them meals. These offerings bred beer wine, honey roast duck vegetables. Fruit were prepared in total silence, often by ritual chefs who had fasted and purified themselves beforehand. The food was laid before the gods in a private ceremony believed to be consumed in essence, after which it was distributed among temple workers. If food was prepared improperly, if the bread cracked, or a piece of meat fell, it might be interpreted as an omen. The gods were always watching. But food also had a darker side. In the oldest texts, spells warned of cursed food meals sent by enemies or restless spirits. Eating the wrong thing on the wrong day could invite disease or misfortune. Even today, archaeologists have found tombs with warnings carved at their entrances. Do not steal from this offering table, or the gods will strike you down. For the Egyptians to deny the dead, their food was not just theft, it was blasphemy. And so funerary food was prepared with the utmost care. A deceased nobleman might be buried with jars of beer cakes, dried fish onions, wine, honey figs, and meats. These were carefully wrapped and placed in niches alongside offering tables, etched in stone with images of eternally replenished feasts. Even poor villagers would bring food to their ancestors' tombs on remembrance days. Nebet did this too, kneeling before her father's resting place with bowls of garlic bread and beer. She whispered his name as she placed the offerings, believing firmly that his spirit would receive the essence of the meal in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, where souls farmed and feasted forever. But not all food was for everyone. Certain items were restricted either by class, religion, or taboo. Pork, for example, was controversial. Some regions avoided it entirely, especially among priests, while others raised pigs for meat and offerings. It wasn't uniformly banned, but its consumption was often debated, tied to ideas of cleanliness, ritual purity, and local tradition. Fish, too, though common among villagers, was avoided by temple elites in certain eras. Priests of particular gods fasted from fish, entirely believing them unclean. The goddess Hathor, for instance, was associated with sweetness, perfume, and beauty. Her followers might avoid sharp-smelling or scavenger species. Even the timing of meals mattered. Certain festivals called for fasting from all solid food, while others demanded indulgence. During the Wag festival, for example, held to honor the dead families, might avoid eating meat for several days, focusing instead on legumes, fruits, and flatbread. At the Opet festival, the reverse was true. Meat flowed freely, and wine was consumed in sacred drunkenness, believed to bring people closer to the gods. In all these practices, food became something more than survival. It became a tool of order. Just as Mayat cosmic balance and justice kept the stars in motion, food rituals helped keep society and the soul in alignment. To feed the gods correctly was to keep the world from slipping into chaos. To feed your family was to prove yourself worthy of life. To feed the dead was to remember that your turn would come next. Late one evening, Nebet sits by her hearth alone. Her children have gone to sleep. Her husband breathes heavily beside their clay wall. She holds a single fig in her hand, dried, dark, sweet. She eats it slowly, not out of hunger, but memory. She thinks of her mother of the first time she was taught to grind flour. She thinks of the gods of the dead, of her place in the endless procession of generations that came before and will come after. And in that small moment, in that single bite, she feels connected to everything. In ancient Egypt, a meal was not just the end of the day. It was a portal, a promise, a prayer. In the world of ancient Egypt, death was not an end. It was a doorway. And when a person crossed that threshold from breath to silence, from earth to the field of reeds, they were not expected to go alone. They carried memories, names, amulets, and food. Always food. In this culture, where every element of life was saturated with spiritual meaning, the rituals surrounding death were the most elaborate of all, and food was at the heart of it. Not only for the mourners left behind, but for the soul beginning its eternal journey. When a person of importance died, the preparation for burial began immediately. While the embalmers worked to preserve the body, removing internal organs, drying it with natron salts, wrapping it in linen layer after layer, a second group worked quietly in the background. The women, the cooks, the priests of the house. They prepared the meals the soul would need, not just for one day, but for eternity. The kitchen of a mortuary house was not filled with grief. It was filled with order. There was a menu carefully preserved in scrolls and passed down by temple tradition. The dead would require bread for nourishment, beer for strength, onions to purify, salt to preserve and protect, meat for power, and sweets as an offering of joy. Everything had a reason. Even the placement of each dish around the tomb was calculated. To the right of the coffin, beer and bread. At the foot, onions, garlic, and dates. Near the head, jars of honey and sesame oil. And always without exception, a bowl of lentils, one of the humblest and most sacred foods in the land. Sometimes the food was real, cooked fresh and buried alongside the body. Other times it was symbolic, carved into stone reliefs on the tomb walls, painted in vivid colors, loaves, wine jugs, steaming meats, baskets overflowing with figs. The Egyptians believed that if something was drawn or inscribed properly and accompanied by the correct spells, it would come alive in the afterlife. This belief gave rise to the funerary menu, a visual feast carved for the dead. A single tomb might contain images of over 50 different foods, including things that person had never tasted in life. In the afterlife, they could finally have it all. Pharaohs, of course, took this to the extreme. In the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, archaeologists discovered entire storerooms filled with food offerings, jars of wine sealed with wax baskets of barley and emmer wheat, preserved meats, fruits wrapped in linen, and even cakes that still carried their scent after 3,000 years. These weren't just grave goods. They were tools for survival in a world beyond time. Because to an Egyptian, death was not passive. It was a journey. The soul would need to travel through dangerous caverns, face judgment, before Osiris defend its heart against the scales of Ma'at, and if found worthy, enter the field of reeds, an eternal paradise, where life continued, much as it had in the physical world, but without pain or loss. And what kind of paradise would it be if one went hungry? Even in the rituals of embalming food was present. When the internal organs were removed, they were washed in palm wine, packed in herbs and resins, and placed in canopic jars. These jars, dedicated to protective gods, guarded the stomach, liver, intestines, and lungs. To the Egyptians, these weren't just body parts. They were vessels of essence, and they too had to be fed. In some funerals, a special rite called the opening of the mouth was performed. A priest would touch the mummy's lips with a ritual blade or spoon, symbolically restoring the ability to eat, breathe, and speak in the next world. Then food would be placed beside the body, a bite of bread, a sip of beer to activate the rite. These gestures, simple in action, were monumental in meaning. They affirmed a truth that echoed across Egyptian tombs and temples: to eat was to live. And even in death, one must be nourished. Outside of royal tombs and high temples, the common people held their own versions of these rites. Nebet, years after the loss of her father, still visits his resting place each year during the Feast of the Valley. She brings a small bundle flatbread garlic, a handful of dates, and a cup of beer. She lays them on the ground, lights incense, and whispers his name. She sits with her children, tells them stories about the man who once taught her how to mend sandals, who held her hand when she first made stew. For a moment, he is with them again. That is the true magic of food in Egyptian belief, not just as fuel for the living or sustenance for the soul, but as a bridge between worlds. As the years pass, empires fall. The pyramids weather. The tombs are robbed. But the images carved into stone remain: a woman offering bread to a god, a man pouring wine for his ancestors, a child biting into a honey cake. And even now, buried beneath centuries of dust, these scenes whisper: we were here. We lived. We loved. We ate. And we remembered. In the end, to understand the ancient Egyptians is to understand how they ate. Not just what they placed into their mouths, but what they offered with their hands, what they passed across tables, what they buried with their dead, what they carved into stone and clay. Food was never just a necessity, it was a language, a belief, a record, a covenant between the land, the gods, and the people who moved through both. Every meal was a moment of balance, an echo of Mayat, the sacred order that held the stars above the Nile and the soil beneath the barley. A bowl of lentils could be both lunch and a prayer. A loaf of bread could be both breakfast and a key to eternity. A sip of beer could be laughter by the riverbank or a final gesture in the tomb's quiet dark. Thousands of years ago, long before the world knew Rome, or the Great Wall, or the cathedrals of Europe, Egyptians were already kneading dough, fermenting grains, salting fish, shaping desserts into lotus flowers. They measured time not only by the sun, but by the rise of yeast. They honored gods not just with gold and incense, but with garlic and figs. They taught their children to grind flour, not only to feed themselves, but to carry on memory, to remember how to survive, how to love, how to give thanks, how to grieve. And somehow, across 3,000 years of shifting dynasties through floods and invasions, droughts and glories, the menu remained remarkably familiar. Bread, beer, onions, garlic, lentils, dates, fish. It wasn't simplicity, it was stability. It was identity. Even now, the remnants of these meals lie silent in tombs, jars sealed with pitch, cracked with time, still fragrant with the ghosts of honey. traces of herbs pressed into the folds of funerary linen, cakes of barley baked in molds of clay, waiting for mouths that will never eat them, yet somehow still feeding the imagination of generations who gaze upon them in museums and ruins, wondering, what did it taste like? What did it mean? And perhaps most astonishing of all is that the people who lived then are not so different from us. They gathered at sunset to share a warm meal after long labor. They worried about harvests. They comforted the sick with food. They made offerings at graves. They found joy in a sweet piece of fruit pride, in a perfect loaf sorrow when the bread burned. They carried their families not with weapons, not with coins, but with nourishment, offering strength in the form of soup and sustenance in the form of love. In Nebet's home, though her name never appears on papyrus scrolls or temple walls, we see this truth most clearly. She was not royalty. She was not a priestess. She was not a scribe. But she fed the future. She raised children with millet and kindness. She shaped bread with reverence. And in doing so, she became part of the great, unbroken river of civilization. We remember pharaohs because they built in stone. We remember women like Nebet because they built in silence, one bowl, one fire, one table at a time. And so, when we ask, what did the ancient Egyptians eat? We are really asking, how did they live? How did they honor time? How did they touch the divine through the everyday? How did they turn food into something sacred? The answer lies not in one grand banquet, but in 1,000 small meals shared across dusty courtyards, lit by oil lamps, and filled with the sound of chewing storytelling laughter and tears. Because in the end, bread is history, beer is culture, a stew is memory, and every meal then and now is a way to say, I am here, I am human, I am trying to survive, to remember, and to give thanks. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, the kitchens of ancient Egypt are still speaking. Somewhere today, a woman stands at her stove, stirring lentils in a small metal pot. A man cuts onions on a wooden board, and their child watches wide-eyed, holding a piece of flatbread between sticky fingers. The pot simmers. The scent of garlic, cumin, and coriander fills the air. It's a meal like any other ordinary, quiet domestic. But it isn't just dinner. It's something older, something sacred. Because without knowing it, they are repeating a ritual that began thousands of years ago along the banks of the Nile. They are reaching backward through centuries of silence and stone, back to a world where every meal was a spell cast for survival, every plate an offering to love, every bite a prayer whispered into the great unknown. When we recreate the dishes of ancient Egypt today, when we bake flatbread pickle onions or pour barley into boiling water, we're not just exploring history. We're entering it. We're breaking bread with the ghosts of brickmakers and bakers, fishermen, and midwives, mothers and grandfathers whose names never made it into scrolls, but whose labor shaped empires. We are bringing their hands into our kitchens, feeling their rhythms in our wrists, their instincts in our senses. The past sits down beside us, silently gratefully. The archaeologist uncovers a clay jar sealed for 3,000 years. Inside the remnants of dried figs, a trace of oil, a fossilized crust of bread. Science will measure the compounds. Scholars will argue over names. But someone once placed that jar into a tomb with trembling fingers and hope. Someone said, "This will feed you in the next life." That act, simple and eternal, binds us across time. We still feed our dead. We still cook to remember. We still gather around meals in moments of grief and celebration alike, just as Nebet once did with her family, just as priests did in temples, just as scribes did in palace halls. Food is the common ground of humanity. It erases class language and empire. It binds us to the soil, to each other, to the mystery. We may not believe in Osiris or Ra. We may not mummify our dead or write spells on papyrus, but we do believe in nourishment, in the need to sit, to share, to taste, to tell stories over bowls and cups. We still leave offerings, perhaps now in the form of birthday cakes, wedding dinners, holiday feasts, or a quiet bowl of soup brought to someone sick. Every culture on earth has its own sacred flavors. And Egypt's story is one of the first to show us how those flavors can outlast even the pharaohs. And perhaps that is why the ruins of Egypt still haunt us. Not just because of their size or grandeur, but because within them was once the smell of frying onions, the sound of children chewing bread, the warmth of a mother's hands shaping dough under a sunlit roof. That is the real magic. Not the gold, not the monuments, but the meals, the ordinary, the remembered. We live now in a world that moves quickly, that forgets to taste, that counts calories instead of blessings. But every time we cook something slow, something real, every time we grind spice by hand or bake with intention, we reclaim something ancient, something human. We become part of the long, unbroken chain of cooks, gatherers, bakers, and brewers. We stand at the end of a recipe that began not in a cookbook, but in the dust beside the Nile. So the next time you eat a piece of flatbread or sip from a warm mug of something fermented and sweet, close your eyes. Listen. You might hear the hum of a marketplace, the chant of a priest, the laughter of children running past mud brick homes. You might feel the presence of someone like Nebet standing beside you in a kitchen of your own, guiding your hands as she guided hers. And you might remember that food is more than memory. It is legacy. It is love. It is the taste of the dead carried into the mouths of the living. It is how we survive the forgetting. As the sun sets behind the broken columns of what once was Memphis or Luxor or Abydos, and the last rays of light fall across the faded reliefs of kitchens carved into stone, we begin to walk away, not because the story is over, but because we know it will follow us. The ancient Egyptians are gone. The temples have crumbled. The gods have fallen silent. And yet their food remains not only in museums or beneath desert sands, but inside us. It lingers in the garlic. We sauté the flatbread, we fold the beer, we pour the onions, we peel without thinking. It lives in the instinct to feed a stranger, to bring fruit to a funeral, to share our last date with someone we love. History has taught us that empires do not last, that kings die, languages fade, monuments are swallowed by time. But food, it survives. Quietly. Patiently. Because food does not need to be carved in stone. It is carved into practice, into memory, into the hands of daughters, learning to knead from their mothers and sons, stirring pots just as their fathers once did. It is passed down, not with words, but with taste, with rhythm, with heat. There is no single recipe that defines ancient Egypt. No surviving cookbook, no exact proportions. But we have fragments, descriptions on tomb walls, scenes in relief seeds found in pottery, carbon traces on ovens. From these, we reimagine. We recreate. We try. And when we do not simply reconstruct a dish, we reconstruct a worldview. Because how a civilization eats reveals how it sees the world. The Egyptians believed that food was a form of order, that eating was an act of cosmic harmony, that feeding the living, the gods, and the dead was part of the same sacred cycle. And so we see in their meals a kind of theology, a belief that survival is not separate from spirit, that flavor can be an offering, that nourishment can be a form of justice. Even now, when we sit down to eat, we echo this truth. We cook not just to satisfy hunger, but to express, to mark occasions, to remember, to hope. Food has always been more than fuel. It is ritual story identity, and this truth stretches backward through every kitchen, every open flame, every bowl placed before the hungry. A thread woven through time from the hearths of Thebes to the rice fields of Asia, the vineyards of Greece, the soup pots of the Andes. The Egyptians held one end of that thread with hands stained by earth and grain and oil. Today, we hold the other. And what do we do with it? We pass it forward. We gather. We bake. We offer. We teach. We remember. We remember Nebet and her lentils. We remember Zia and the onions she peeled. We remember the priest whispering a blessing over honeyed bread. We remember the father who placed dates beside his wife's tomb, believing she would taste them in the world beyond. We remember that in the end, what connects us all is not what we build, but what we share. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Egyptian food, not what was eaten or how it was seasoned, but that every meal mattered. Whether eaten by a pharaoh in gold or a brickmaker by firelight, each bite was a moment of presence, a pause, a promise, a reminder that even in a world ruled by death, life could be made beautiful. One meal at a time. There are tastes we will never know. Recipes whispered in languages no longer spoken measured, not in cups or spoons, but in instinct and feel, in the invisible knowledge passed from hand to hand, mother to daughter, grandmother to grandson. They have vanished, not with fire or flood, but with silence. In ancient Egypt, there were once meals made only for gods, dishes prepared just for the new moon stews, brewed in temple kitchens for a ritual no one now remembers. There were breads shaped to honor forgotten festivals, herbs once sacred, now extinct spices once bartered for in markets that no longer exist. No scroll recorded their precise preparation. No monument described their aroma. They lived only in the moment of eating, and then they were gone. Yet in their loss there is a lesson. Because food like memory is fragile, it must be tended, practiced, kept alive through repetition. When a people lose their food, they lose more than flavor. They lose story. They lose identity. They lose the heartbeat of daily life, the small sacred acts that make a person feel at home in the world. And so we must ask, what are we losing today? As modern life accelerates, as convenience replaces ritual, as taste becomes engineered, we risk forgetting the very things that once rooted us. We swap fermentation for preservatives, community meals for isolated bites between meetings. We count nutrients instead of blessings. We ask food to be fast instead of meaningful. And slowly, quietly, the ancient rhythm fades. But not completely. Because every time someone bakes bread from scratch, every time someone plants onions in the soil with care, every time someone tells a child, "This is how your grandmother used to cook," something ancient stirs. Something whispers. Not everything is lost. Some flavors survive in fragments, the dates we still eat, the garlic, we still crush, the honey that still drips golden across the tongue. In them is Egypt. In them is history. Even in the quietest corners of the world, echoes remain. A woman in Sudan kneads dough under the desert sun. A man in Upper Egypt stirs beans over a clay stove. The tools may have changed. The names, the gods, the cities. But the gesture is eternal. To feed, to preserve, to remember. And so we return, not to the grandeur of tombs or the gold of kings, but to the humbler places, kitchens made of mud brick gardens, tucked behind homes, mortars worn smooth by generations. These are the places where culture endured, where Egypt truly lived, where its people, most of them never named, never famous, made sense of their world through what they could grow, cook, share, and taste. In truth, we are all inheritors of forgotten kitchens. We live in a world built not only by engineers and emperors, but by bakers, brewers, farmers, and cooks. by those who never made history but made dinner, who never led armies but led children to sit, eat, and listen, who never left monuments but left behind full bellies and quiet moments of joy. And so perhaps the final act of honoring Egypt is not to look at what remains, but to feel what still resonates, to pause before a meal, any meal, and ask, what am I carrying forward? Whose hands shaped this? Whose taste lingered here long ago? Because no civilization truly disappears as long as its food still nourishes. And every time we eat with intention, with reverence, with memory, we keep the feast alive. And now, as we rise from the table of history and dust the crumbs of time from our hands, we take one final glance back at ancient Egypt, not as a place of myth or marble, but as a home, a living, breathing home. We've walked through kitchens without roofs, sat in courtyards warmed by sun, and silent stirred lentils beside children's laughter and elders' advice. We've watched bread rise beneath calloused fingers, smelled onions caramelizing in clay pots, felt the sacred weight of even the simplest meal. And now we know this civilization, this vast empire of stone and spirit, was built not only by gods and kings, but by hungry people with tired hands and generous hearts. It's easy to think of history as something grand, something distant. But history lives in the most ordinary places, in the hiss of steam, in the crackle of firewood, in the shared glance over a humble plate. The Egyptians understood this deeply. To them, food was not just survival, it was the soul's language. Through it, they blessed their dead, honored their gods, comforted their sick, and celebrated their life. Through it, they became eternal. And now, so do we. Because every time we cook with care, we repeat their prayers. Every time we eat with intention, we echo their beliefs. Every time we sit, share, and taste slowly, we keep the fire burning across centuries, across silence, across civilizations that no longer speak but still remember. So the next time you break bread, whether soft or burnt simple or rich, know that you are not alone. You are surrounded by millions of hands that came before you. Some were slaves, some were farmers, some were scribes, brewers, bakers, children lovers. All of them sat where you sit now. And somewhere deep in the memory of the earth, their kitchens are still warm. Their feast continues. And you, by listening, by remembering, by tasting, have become part of it.